lot to cover, and we'll start off. And just to give a little bit of background again about me, when I was in-house, I was the head of FCPA compliance for AIG during the financial crisis and under a corporate monitorship. And then I was the chief compliance officer for two of General Electric's big business units, one in Connecticut and one in California. And recently went back into private practice in the last 3 or 4 years, where compliance has been a cornerstone of my practice. Relocated to Dallas from California in early 2021. So I think it's important to get a sense of the audience when we have these conversations. My preference is generally not to speak and show slides. We have slides, and we're going to talk through some slides, but I mean, as interactive as we possibly can get. It's a fairly large group, which I think is great, but I think it's for us to get a sense of where we may want to tailor some of the conversation. I'd love to get a sense of, people that work or people in the audience that work at public versus private companies, so people in public companies, could you possibly raise your hand? Presumably the private are the ones not raising their hands. Okay. And from an industry standpoint, some of the key industries, people in the energy sector, raise their hands. Okay. How about financial services? Technology? Okay. And healthcare. Great. From a sort of staffing perspective, within the function, and I don't know if we have folks here that touch the function, who manage the function, who run the function, but from your estimation or your experience within your companies, what's the size of the compliance function? Is it 1 to 5 employees? How many people here have a compliance function of 1 to 5? Okay, and 5 to 10? Okay, and 10 to 20? All right, and then more than 20. Good. All right, feel free to ask questions throughout. We're designing this to be somewhat practical. There is a lot of recent guidance. Years and years ago, compliance didn't have as many places or understanding the elements of a program, understanding what enforcement agencies and regulators expected of companies was a little bit more mysterious. I think over the last several years, including even recently in March 2023, the Department of Justice updated its evaluation of corporate compliance programs, a fairly important and critical tool in analyzing internally where you match up and where you measure up with respect to your compliance program. But what's important, and one of the other things to sort of consider as we're going through the presentation, is that, and this is clear from the Department of Justice guidance, it can't be a one-size-fits-all. A compliance program for an unregulated tech company is not going to be the same as a publicly traded financial services firm. That's just, it seems intuitive, but it's something that when you're looking to develop your program, designing your program, and maybe even benchmarking your program against your peers, that you want to consider companies that are similarly sized in similar industries that have similar risk profiles. And that'll become more evident as we go through. That's us. Okay. So just to give an overview, there's some practical things to discuss from a compliance program standpoint. There's, at least when I was doing this for 10 years, there certainly was a shift in the beginning. Compliance is killing us, they're difficult, why do we have to have them, why does the function try to stop business? And those are all things that somehow potentially carry over year after year with respect to management's view and executive or even mid-level management view that compliance is somehow there to prevent or prohibit business. And the answer to that really is that you're not. You're there to promote a sound and ethical business practice. It's something that can be used as a tool to demonstrate to your relationships, your third-party relationships, your customers, even competitors in the market, that having a sound compliance program where employees know the guardrails and and your employees are fully vested and aware of, you know, what's right and wrong, can in fact give you a competitive advantage. You know, if you're bidding against a company that has a limited compliance program, potential enforcement action against them, and you can demonstrate you have, you know, a strong and robust compliance program, and you're committed to sound ethical business practices from a business standpoint, it's going to hopefully give you a competitive advantage. And that's one of the sort of the talking points for management and leadership in the benefit and value add that compliance gives to your organization, not simply as a police officer or an entity telling your business people what they can't do. It's supposed to be something and can be sold, I think, as something that promotes business. When I was in-house for 10 years, my job was not to say no. My job was to say, how can we possibly get to yes? And that's the overall sort of mantra to have in your mind if you're involved or if you're in a compliance function, you're running it or working with your GC's office, is we're here to help. We're here to put together, you know, a strategy and a risk plan and a risk mitigation plan that will allow us to comfortably understand risk and comfortably move forward with a potential transaction. Ultimately, management will make a decision on whether or not to proceed and go forward with something that's potentially high risk, but the analysis of how you got there and the analysis of how ultimately a decision was made is going to be a critical piece of any evaluation of your program if something goes wrong. So again, those are some of the high-level points to talk about. Obviously, you know, in the next slide, Ryan will talk about that the Department of Justice has very specific expectations. So aside from your being able to go in without referencing law enforcement, without referencing, you know, enforcement actions, just talking as a business partner of the organization, the first slide really gives you some indications to say, this is, you know, why compliance is important and why we need to integrate it and why we need to ensure it's you know, moving forward appropriately. So I'll let Ryan talk about the DOJ.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. As Louis was mentioning, compliance has been a really key point for the DOJ, especially with their March 2023 guidance updating the effectiveness of compliance programs, and it's been an important topic. And this was in their evaluation of corporate compliance programs that they updated in March 2023. And the three fundamental questions to consider is whether the program is well designed, is the program adequately resourced and empowered to be effective, and does the program work in practice? So this goes back to Lewis's point talking about one size doesn't fit all. It really needs to be well designed, not just as big as it possibly can, but does it actually target the areas that the DOJ is concerned with, especially in regulated industries? The DOJ asks whether and to what extent the corporation's compliance program is effective at the time of the charging decision or resolution. So after the DOJ has already charged, it's too late to then try to make your compliance program more effective or more robust in an attempt to mitigate the DOJ's enforcement action. And evaluation of compliance program effectiveness depends on a company's risk profile and solutions to mitigate identified risks. Going back once again to one size doesn't fit all. Factors the DOJ considers include but aren't limited to company size, industry, geographic footprint, and regulatory landscape.
I just stop there. So,
yeah.
I mean, as a simple example here, if you are a mid-sized company doing work primarily domestically with no interactions with foreign entities, foreign governments, foreign officials, then, you know, having a 5-person, you know, very large FCPA program is probably not where you want to deploy your resources, probably not where you want to, you know, focus your time and attention. That said, it is important to document from a risk standpoint that this is the reason why you did not have as much of a program or robust of a program around that risk area versus, for example, maybe fraud on the commercial side or conflicts of interest to the extent that there's a number of, you're in a small business and there's a potential number of business folks that are trying to work with family members and third-party vendors, things of that nature. So it's really an important thing to consider as you, and it goes to the resource allocation we'll talk about later, but that's the identifying your upfront risks is really what's going to drive ultimately how you're going to develop your program, design your program, to use the DOJ's words, and then ultimately roll out your program and make sure it's effective. And this at the bottom is new, so this is something that just recently came out, that after a resolution, there's an expectation that the CEO of the company and the chief compliance officer of the company will be asked to provide certifications to the department that their program is reasonably designed. That's from someone sitting in the chair of the chief compliance officer or someone that's got that responsibility regardless of title. That is a daunting thing to see, because you're putting your name on the line going to a prosecutorial agency to say, yes, I've done work sufficient to, in my mind, certify and demonstrate that the program's reasonably designed. Now this is not going to happen unless you're talking about, at least for now, the way the guidance is drafted. It's in the context of releasing you from obligations of a resolution agreement. So you've already had an issue, you've already had an investigation, the enforcement agency's already come and looked at it. There's a document, a deferred prosecution agreement, non-prosecution agreement, or some document that's in place. But in order to release yourself from whatever obligations are contained within those agreements, the CCO is going to be asked to certify as to the reasonable design of the program, which I can tell you, having sat in that role, is definitely something that could potentially get you to lose a little bit of sleep at night if you're in that role. So some key takeaways at the outset. Compliance programs have a practical and business-centered purpose. We talked about that. Working with your business folks to integrate to them or to sell them on the fact that compliance has a business value-added proposition for you and for the company to generate more revenue and to be looked at amongst your peers and competitors as a company that others want to do business with over potentially others. Compliance programs are under serious scrutiny by the Department of Justice and enforcement agencies. I think when you're looking at the fundamental cornerstone of the design of a program, and whether you've designed your program effectively or it's well designed, it really has to start with upfront risk analysis. That's just something that has been talked about and written about, and from a compliance officer's professional perspective is actually accurate. How can you even start to develop a program around various risks without understanding what the risks actually are within your organization? One size does not fit all. We talked about that. You can't have a compliance program for a highly regulated financial institution is going to look very different from a compliance program for a manufacturing company. It's just going to be a very different look and feel of the program. Compliance resource allocation is critical. I'm sure if I asked the question of compliance officers or people sitting within compliance or legal today, do you have enough resources? Are you adequately resourced? Do you feel like the team really that there's not a need to hire? My experience has been absolutely not. There's always a need for more people. There's always a need for additional resources. Obviously, businesses operate and businesses have budgets, and you obviously make the case for how many resources you need, how many resources are appropriate. It'll change in the unfortunate event that there is an investigation or an enforcement action. Trust me, your resource allocation will change, the number of resources you'll get will change. This really is an assessment at the beginning when the company may not have had any blips, may not have any ongoing investigations, ongoing enforcement matters. The question really is, do we have enough resources? Likely the answer, you're going to say to yourself, probably not. So how do you allocate the resources you do have to get to the government's, is it well designed and effective and implemented properly, and is it working? that's one of the things to consider. We'll talk about that in one of the slides later on. And then, again, can't emphasize this enough, that effective compliance programs require stakeholder engagement and commitment by all levels of management, and also all levels cross-functionally. Compliance is everyone's responsibility, and the compliance function is a function that quarterbacks and sort of takes the lead and responsibility for the program, but without support from senior leadership, the board, without working closely with your cross-functional teams, your HR, your legal, your finance departments, it'll be virtually impossible to effectively roll out a compliance program for your organization and tailor it in the way that it needs to be tailored to make sure your resources are properly allocated. It's definitely a group effort. And there's ways to hopefully engage if you're having issues with that and you can't get attention from, because everyone has their day jobs. HR's got a ton on its plate. Finance obviously has a lot of things. They're getting the books ready for audits and whatnot. But there needs to be some level of interaction with either the leaders of those organizations or some delegate of those organizations to have a regular rhythm and communication about compliance. Okay, this seems probably fairly obvious, but bears repeating. You've never had an enforcement action. Can an effective compliance program wait? And the answer to that, from my perspective, is no. The guidance has made it clear that the government evaluates effectiveness of a company's compliance program. They actually evaluate it at 2 stages, one at the time of the offense, and then also at the time of the charging decision. Now, there's not usually a tremendous amount of time between those 2 windows, but they certainly look at it, they don't look at it and say, oh, they're doing a great job now they're in trouble. That is not going to get you, from the government's perspective, any credit to them saying you don't have a problem, or we're not necessarily going to charge you, or we're going to defer the charges. It's really, they're looking at it from the time of the offense through the time of the charging decision. So to say to yourself, oh, we're okay, we don't have to really put a lot of resources and energy and time into our compliance function because we've had no issues, it's a little short-sighted. And you hear that. I've heard that from people at programs. I've heard it internally in my own roles. I've heard it from clients. Why are we doing this now? We've been on the up and up, but the detriment to waiting and the detriment to waiting to a potential issue really does eviscerate any benefit a compliance program gives you when the government's considering to bring charges or charge you for some form of criminal liability. Today, if your program's at its infancy and you need enhancements, the one thing that I caution people to do is they try to do too much at once, and then they end up getting nothing done. And that's just the practical reality of it. I think you really need to set forth a prioritization plan and to prioritize and look at some key factors of the program to see whether or not you've done a risk assessment. And that's going to be a common theme here. The government's going to look right away at your risk assessment if there's an issue. So if you haven't done one, or you did one 2 years ago and it's static, the top priority is to conduct one fairly quickly. That's going to give you a sense of the change, or the sense of whether or not the risk profile has been modified, and a sense of whether or not the current program matches up with the risk profile. Have we identified those risks? That's part of the same assessment of risk assessment. Has senior management and mid-level management been engaged regarding these risks? Now, it's a little bit nuanced there because you don't necessarily have to include the senior management. There's different ways to do risk assessments. Some of them do include senior management, but to the extent that you're doing it with more mid-level folks and doing a middle to the top or middle to the bottom assessment of where your risks are, you want to make sure that once those risks are identified, that the board and senior management are made aware of your findings, that the risks we see the company having are these 5 risks: sanctions risk, corruption risk, antitrust risk. And I would not stop at that. I would also then stop and put together what you believe would be a mitigation plan when you're presenting that to the board or to senior management. Things I used to get told on a regular basis when I was more junior in the roles were, we don't like to hear problems, we like to hear solutions. So, obviously they want to be aware, but my recommendation is once you start to engage with that level of the organization, identify those risks, but have an action plan ready to go to say this is how we're going to mitigate these risks. Demonstration from tone at the top. That's been something that's been in the literature, that's been in enforcement actions. There's no tone from the top, or there is tone from the top. Tone from the top essentially is that the highest levels of the organization, from the board of directors down, care about compliance, talk about compliance, and sets an example for the rest of the organization that compliance is critical, that compliance that the failure or the lack to maintain compliance is not tolerated. Again, to the extent that these are things that haven't yet occurred and you're looking at whether or not your program needs to be better designed, I'll use a different word from well designed by the DOJ, but better designed, consider how to engage with the senior management to get some communications out and engage with the senior management on providing or demonstrating and then documenting that tone from the top. It's something that's going to come up right away. If there's a big compliance miss, one of the first questions that you're going to get asked is, show us, your CEOs or your leadership team's engagement and commitment to compliance. And if you don't have that, that's going to be a very big mark against you. So again, these are just giving you some things to look at in the short term. If your program you think is at its infancy, compliance programs are iterative. They're going to change over time. They're supposed to change over time. There's this idea that a compliance program is not a paper program, and what that really means is, someone comes in and they put together a bunch of policies and documents and they put it in some folder or some portal, and they say, hey, I got my compliance program. And the government uses the quote, paper compliance program. So that's not what they want. They want to see that it's, it's living, it's breathing, it's modified, it's amending, it's evolving. And, if you don't have some of the things that are here on this slide, I would recommend starting with those things, because those are the things that the government's going to look at fairly quickly, and you'll get a lot of potential cover and kudos for these types of activities that are listed here. Do I have written policies and procedures? Again, it's all about the risk. If you have a 40-page FCPA policy with 0 FCPA risk, that's not convincing anyone of anything. Do you have the policies in place for the risks that you've identified? Mechanisms in place for employees, again, very important, for employees to raise concerns. One of the key ways, your internal control environment, your policies and procedures, they set forth what's right, what's wrong, how to ultimately raise concerns. The policy should indicate that. There should be many different ways that employees can learn how to raise concerns. So that's an important aspect to get up right away, up and running, whether it's a whistleblower hotline, whether it's some other internal mechanism that employees feel comfortable raising concerns. I started off in a business where after 8 or 9 months, we had no employee concerns raised. And I presented it to the board, and the board looked at me and said, that is a bad thing. That is not a good thing. That you have zero, over a 6 or 7 month period, that you have 0 concerns raised for a 35,000 person business. And that's true. To the extent that you have 0, it's one of two, it's a few things. It's either employees are not aware of how to raise concerns, or employees are fearful and the culture of compliance is actually detrimental because people feel raising compliance concerns are going to impact them professionally in some meaningful way. So again, these are just sort of anecdotes from my personal experience, but raising employee concerns is going to be another thing that an enforcement agency is going to really hone in on and want to understand, what the mechanisms are in place for that activity. And then investigating employee concerns. Once someone raises a concern, great, and what do you do about it? You don't just let it sit there, right? So you have to figure out the best way to triage it, understand it, investigate it, More often than not, you're going to be able to, assuming you have the staffing and the resources, and I'm an outside counsel, and I'll tell you, if you have the resources internally, I would always start with an internal review to determine whether there is any there, whether, if there's something there that potentially going to be violative of a policy or violative of a law, then consider whether you need additional, help from either an outside counsel or forensic firm. But for companies that have the luxury of having some investigation staff internally, when these types of employee concerns come in, they should be in some way graded, and I would always start with in-house teams looking at some of these concerns before an evaluation and ultimately a decision's made to bring someone from the outside to look. That's just good compliance from my perspective.
And this also likely seems kind of obvious, but compliance programs aren't limited just to public companies. It's a misconception that only public companies must maintain an effective compliance program. And importantly, there's nothing in the DOJ guidance that limits compliance programs to public companies. And for enforcement statutes like the FCPA, that's also not limited to just public companies. It applies to all companies. So in short, a company status as a private entity, it's not a defense to having an ineffective compliance program. You can't just hide behind the fact that you're not a public company. You need to have an effective compliance program for all companies.
You and I can go through this one together, but
sure.
I said this at the outset, compliance is not the sole responsibility of compliance, or compliance department, or the compliance in general is not the sole responsibility of the compliance or legal department. They play a critical role in developing, implementing, assessing aspects of the program, and then working with senior leaderships to get buy-in. But ultimately, every employee in the organization, including the board, every employee, the board, and even the senior management has responsibility for compliance. That's something that is almost at this stage, based on guidance from the DOJ, is black letter. In their recent March 2023 update on the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, it explicitly states it's important for a company to create and foster a culture of ethics and compliance with law at all levels of the company. The effectiveness of a compliance program requires a high-level commitment by company's leadership to implement a culture of compliance from the middle and the top. So essentially what we're saying here is compliance needs to be owned by all. Now, there are mechanisms to facilitate the program and the expectations to the entire employee population. And there's ways in which you engage with key stakeholders to get that message out. But to the extent that, employees are not doing the right thing in a certain area, those are compliance responsibilities of those employees. The question that you're going to look at, if those types of activities are occurring and misconduct by employees in a certain business unit, for example, are occurring, how did the messaging about compliance not reach these employees? Or if it did, what happened? So that's something that is an important thing to consider. You really are not an island alone as a compliance professional. You're not operating solely and independently with respect to the rollout and the implementation and making sure the program is seeping into the day-to-day activities. You're a large part of that, but you do need to engage with your stakeholders. Things that work, for example, are working with your finance leaders and your HR leaders and your technology CTOs or CIOs, asked to speak at their staff meetings, asked to have some compliance moments or compliance anecdotes, lessons learned at a staff meeting once every 6 months, and start to really integrate the concepts with the buy-in of that leader, with the buy-in of the functional leader. One of the things I experienced internally was when I had messages sent out from the CEO to the entire organization, we got a fair response. I think we got a fair amount of folks that received that message, a fair amount of folks that raised questions as a result of the message. But when I actually had functional leaders, the CFO, the HR, the head of legal, actually go out into their staff and they made those presentations to the their own staffing, the numbers got exponentially higher. So I think there's going to be, the experience is that the CEO who sits at the top, people are going to listen and people are going to, maybe take notice and they're going to have some, level of understanding and some level of interest. But when it's someone that's directly the boss of your function, that actually matters more to a lot of employees. So don't stop at the CEO sent this message out. I think to effectively integrate the ethical tenets of the company and the compliance program elements of a company, I would go down to, to the direct reports of the CEO and work with them to get the messaging out. And if you have to go even lower down and meet with the group that deals with employee compensation in the HR department, go even further down if need be. So it's really an assessment of how are you going to get the most folks involved to understand what compliance is, what it means to them, and what it means to the health and wealth of the organization. Anything on this? No?
Got it.
Okay. Want to do risk assessment next?
Yeah, I can do
All
it.
right. Resources are limited. What now? So as I said before, as a practical matter, most people sitting in a compliance role will likely wish for additional resources. The risk assessment is the best tool in your arsenal to identify risks and allocate whatever limited resources you have. Again, we talked about that a little bit before, where if you have a department of, let's say, I think a lot of people had 10 to 20 people in their organization in the compliance function. If you have low antitrust risk but have 5 people addressing antitrust risk, that is not a healthy allocation of resources. And if you have significant corruption risk and you don't have, you're deploying one person and spreading out people to handle things that are of much less importance or much less of a key risk, that's something that the DOJ in particular is going to take notice. You identify these risks as key risks, but you had one person responsible for this key risk, and then you had 2 people responsible for a risk that was somewhere down the road, down towards the middle of the list of risks. So that's where you're going to get your resource allocation. And even if they question it, even if something that comes up and the department says, listen, we don't agree with your risk assessment, which they may not do, they likely won't do, the point is you have information, you have data, you have a program to present to say, no, this is how we got to these risks. You may differ, but we've presented this, we've dealt with this internally, we've developed a whole series of mechanisms to get to where we think our risk profile sits, and that's a very positive story and document to present. If you're challenged on whether or not this misconduct occurred in a risk that the government says is a key risk, if your belief is it's not, and this is what you did to demonstrate that it's not a key risk, that's going to be a better story for you to tell. Because everyone looks at, say the government looks at, and the enforcement agencies are going to look at, did your compliance program measure up against risk? So you are going to be tasked with really explaining that in some way, shape, or form ever in an enforcement action. It's much easier to do that now as you get back to your offices and say, when was the last risk assessment I did? Let me consider, if this risk assessment needs to be changed. But if there's something that falls outside of your key risks that happens, it's going to be a much difficult conversation for the government to say your program's not effective because your response is, no, the program we designed based on your guidance was we addressed the risks, the key risks, and this is how we got to our key risks. So that's something that has definitely been a conversation that I've previously had with enforcement agencies that's been somewhat successful. Does the compliance function have a dedicated compliance officer? Again, depending on the nomenclature in your business, is it the chief compliance officer or compliance leader? But there is an expectation that there is an individual with high-level authority, high in the structure of a company that's got day-to-day responsibility for compliance. My recommendation is that person does not have other responsibilities. The person designated as the head of compliance is really solely and focused on compliance. He's not the chief compliance officer and the head of IP or something. That's sometimes my experience is getting into trouble that way, because ultimately, how much time is that person spending on compliance versus the IP function? You really want to have someone that's dedicated in that role. I'll take the last two here.
Sure.
I'm talking too much. I'm sorry.
Does the compliance function have access to data and assess risks associated with policy breaches and transactions? And then also, does the company have systems in place to establish incentives for compliance and disincentives for non-compliance?
All right. So these are two fairly new things that have come out recently, and we'll talk also a little bit about messaging apps, which has been a focus of the and communication via messaging apps on personal phones is another topical area that the government's very focused on right now. But data, and again, we'll talk about this later, but the DOJ's criminal unit, the fraud unit, just hired a council that is really responsible for data and data analytics, something that they've been talking about for quite some time. You need to use data and data analytic type tools to enhance and empower your compliance function. So this really gets to what data do you have, and we'll talk about data on a separate slide, but what data does the compliance function have access to in order to evaluate risks, in order to evaluate the strength of the program or the weaknesses in the program. And the government's expectation is that you're going to be using pools of data to assess and analyze those risks, and assess and analyze the development of the program. Incentives for compliance and disincentives for non-compliance. This is something where you're going to have to work very, very carefully and closely with your HR department and your legal department. That putting in incentives to if a salesperson is doing a lot of things, selling to a lot of high-risk countries and doing things like that, but they're maintaining a really solid understanding of compliance and doing a great job with respect to coordinating with the compliance and legal functions and making sure they're fully aware of the processes. There could be incentives for that. Conversely, if you have someone in the organization that disregards the policies, doesn't want to talk to anyone in compliance, and does things on his or her own way, where possibly there's an investigation as a result because we may have made a payment to a government official, the government's expectation is that there's going to be disincentives. You're going to get in trouble for that. That's something that you're going to be disciplined for. So again, this is something where you're working with your HR function very closely to set up mechanisms to provide for, but we talk about incentives and disincentives. That a lot of that means is compensation. That's what it means. Are you going to get no bonus if you have this issue this year? Are you going to get possibly a higher bonus because you really acted within the confines of the compliance program and did a great job in not only your actual day-to-day operation of compliance, but you spread the message of compliance. So that's essentially what the government's getting at is, they've identified that money is very important to people that work, which it is. And if you want to do things the right way, the company's more than happy to give you money. If you want to do things the wrong way, the company will take away your money. So that's essentially some of the things on the horizon.
And some of the factors to consider when doing a risk assessment are the location of operations, industry, market competition, regulatory landscape, potential clients and business partners, interactions with foreign government officials. So like Louis just mentioned, don't bribe people from foreign governments, that's pretty bad. And whether compliance program has been tailored to the risk assessment, for tailoring it specifically for the key areas of risk that have been identified as opposed to a one-size-fits-all. And one of the important things when conducting a risk assessment is process and methodology, where there needs to be an emphasis on the data collected, the metrics used, and the documentation of that process, which will come into play later on if there is an enforcement action. You need to document how you got to the key risk factors that you've identified, and the data you've collected and how that process went about. Basically to explain it later to the government if you have to. This is me too?
I can do this.
Okay.
Resource allocation, I think we've talked about this a number of times already throughout. And the guidance really tells you your risk assessment should be used to establish your resource allocation. And again, are you spending a disproportionate amount on time and employee staff on low risks? It's something that is in the guidance, something the government's going to look at if there's been a miss in a specific key area. So it's something to consider when you're looking at what roles and responsibilities exist within the compliance function for risks from the top highest risks down to your lowest risks. Another important piece is the risk assessment static or revised as needed. If you do a risk assessment once every 3 years, that is not good. The risk assessment needs to be iterative. It needs to be updated and enhanced for a number of reasons. I mean, part of it is your company's changing on a year-by-year basis, most likely. There may have been a compliance issue that came up that impacts or something you may not have thought about originally as a potential risk, but then a lesson learned from a risk event that occurred will ultimately lead you to reconsider and evaluate your risk assessment. Whether or not your company has acquired any new businesses, again, in personal experience, sitting in a business unit and all domestic operations, and suddenly we acquire the Latin American operations of a major public company. That's going to change your risk profile from a geography standpoint, from a risk standpoint, generally speaking. If you've not assessed your risk assessment within a reasonable time, there's no definitive time frames here. It's really just talking about within a reasonable time. If you haven't reassessed your risk based on an activity like that within a reasonable time, that's something that is going to be looked at as you're not meeting the standards or obligations. If there is a new product introduction, in the tech space in particular, if there's a new product that's going to have encryption and you're going to be sending encryption out, I mean, things that you may not have otherwise had previously as a potential risk, now because of new products that you have or new products you're offering, your risk profile is going to change. Expectation is you're assessing that and doing a new risk assessment or analysis around that. New geographies and then new laws or regulations that come out, that's hopefully fairly obvious. For example, years ago, the GDPR came out, or the UK Bribery Act came out, and companies that were doing business in the UK were looking at that and saying, what do I have to do here? How do I assess the risk of that in my company? If those two regulations came out or laws came out and companies that did business in the UK decided that they weren't going to actually assess the risk, that's not a good day. So that's, again, it's a very high level example, but I think it proves the point. And does the risk assessment account for lessons learned and prior compliance issues? Important part there is that's where you collect data. You collect data along the way of compliance fails, investigations, incidents, remediation and mitigation of those incidents, and you'll start to get a picture of possible issues or possible risks that you may not have accounted for, or possible gaps in controls that you knew the risk was there, but whatever controls you had in place didn't prevent this activity from occurring or this misconduct from occurring. So therefore, we need to assess whether or not the controls we have in place to mitigate these risks are actually, in fact, working. That's another part of your risk assessment. It doesn't just go to identifying the risks, but it really goes down to your program for mitigating those risks. And if there is an issue, do you need to look at your assessment, or do you need to look at your plan for mitigating the risks? Because more likely than not, one of those two things is off, and you're going to want to change it.
And for written policies and procedures, really the cornerstone of any written policies and procedures that a company has is its code of conduct that sets forth the commitment to full compliance with applicable laws. This needs to be endorsed by senior leadership and the board, and it also needs to be available and easily accessible to all employees. So putting that on an intranet site, have it during onboarding training, and then also periodic training referring back to the code of conduct. Written policies and procedures to incorporate compliance in day-to-day operations is also important. This is going back to avoiding having a paper compliance program. So even if policies exist in written form, you have to demonstrate that they've been rolled out and implemented, not just that we have all these written policies and procedures in our code of conduct sitting on an intranet site that people can look at whenever they want. That's just not enough. The policies need to be accessible and comprehensive, easy to read, and avoid sweeping legal statements and standard. Your employees need to be able to understand what the compliance program and the policies and procedures mean and what it means for them. That's really important. And then also having policy gatekeepers who have been assigned to verify that policies are up to date. Do they know what misconduct to look out for, how to escalate potential concerns? Like, that's also really important to have that as a part of your policy.
Yeah, and the gatekeeper function is really important because let's say you're a financial services institution and you certainly have money laundering risk and you have sanctions risk. And obviously, I won't even talk about the whole panoply of bank regulatory risk that you have. But we'll take two core corporate compliance risks of AML and sanctions. If you have a policy that's written, that's out there, people see, that says, AML is bad, or you can't do business with these countries, that is a start. But you really need to integrate that and work with gatekeepers, people within the organization that are responsible for onboarding new customers, opening new banking relationships, working with your CRM systems to manage your customer database. Those individuals need to be integrated into the policies and procedures to, at a minimum, identify red flags that come up. These are the red flags that come up with respect to money laundering and opening up this new account, or this country is on a do not do business with list, and SDN is on the list, or the alternative. And if that policy exists but no one's operationalizing it, and the gatekeepers of, as I said, either account opening or people managing customer relationships are not familiar with those policies and don't necessarily know how to escalate risks, even if they are familiar with those policies, then that's not an effective program. That's just a piece of paper that says we don't want to facilitate money laundering, and we don't want to do business with bad actors and people that are sanctioned. That's great. But what are you doing about it? That's the critical piece, making sure you're working with gatekeepers. We have 5 minutes left. So I thought we would probably only talk for 20. I talked way too much, so I apologize. I don't know if you want, the presentations are on everyone's desk. I laid them out there. I don't know if anyone has questions on what they've heard thus far, but I don't want to bar questions with 5 minutes left only. So if anyone has questions, feel free. I'll be here all day, but feel free to ask now. Ryan will be here for a while.
Yeah.
There's been much discussion about the potential consequences for compliance officers who make the certification.
What we haven't seen, there's been discussion, and there's certainly been discussion at the government level, and there's been discussion internally, at law firms, and certainly I'm sure within the CCO community, starting to benchmark and think about it. We haven't seen it in practice as of yet. I can tell you that I was under, when I worked at one of my companies, we were under the review of an independent compliance monitor the entire time that I was there, and the compliance monitor required the CCO to do this. This was back in 2010 or 11. So it's not new to me, and we had a lot of discussion at senior leadership and up through the board on what we could and could not certify. It definitely leads to a level of risk for that individual that's sitting in that role to certify ultimately, because if for whatever reason there's a determination that it's not well designed, then there could be, we've seen criminal prosecutions of compliance officers. That's out there, that's been happening. So it's something that is on the horizon. It's something that I don't believe, at least within the last month I've looked, I haven't seen any certifications, but it's definitely something that I think is on the minds of people that sit in compliance leadership roles, whether CCO or some other name, and looking at the guidance here and trying to really determine that the program is well designed within the confines of the evaluation document that's been put out is the best you can do. Whether or not that is going to satisfy the government is another story. It's another looks like it's going to be another iterative dialogue about you certify to this and prove it, and that's going to get somewhat, it'll get somewhat protracted and it could get somewhat hairy. But I think we have to wait and see to see what exactly is going to be the first instance of a certification that the government doesn't believe to be correct. I mean, at this stage, it's really just getting you out of your obligations under under a resolution. It's not something they're asking for proactively in order not to charge. It's not something they're asking for proactively to demonstrate effectiveness. So it really happens with respect to there's been an issue already. So again, it's hard to generalize, but on a case-by-case basis, obviously looking at the issues that were determined to be faulty or that failed and the systems in place that didn't necessarily work that resulted in the potential issue, my guess would be we would focus on, my advice as an outside counsel is start with that and focus on how we've modified that to be reasonably designed to avoid this issue in the future. But as I said, we'll have to see it happen in practice. It's difficult to answer hypothetically. I think that's it. I'm being given this. So obviously, as I said, presentations are on the desk if you want to take them with you. Any questions, obviously feel free. We're around during the day. And thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for being a part. Take care.